Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to do this quick video to give you some more information about the causes of the War of 1812. It's kind of an interesting war. It often gets forgotten, but it really does tell us a lot about the early 1800s, and some of that is just really important to where we're headed next. And remember that this has a little bit of a global context to it. Remember that the War of 1812 is really a U.S. War with England, and it feels like a redo in a sense of the Revolutionary War, but it's really much less about some of the bad blood, between the colonies and England related to the Revolutionary War. It's much more so about the Napoleonic Wars, and the United States really gets kind of caught in between some of the efforts that Britain and France, are lobbing at each other, and the United States is trying to be neutral, but yet is a very big, commercial, economic partner with both Britain and France. And what really drives the beginnings of this war, has to do with economic policies like Napoleon's continental system to try to essentially blockade Britain economically. The United States is no longer able to send commercial ships to Britain, and then Britain responds in kind with the orders the orders of council, and those orders change over time, but for the most part, they stop the United States from trading with France because the United States is forced to go to Britain and have things, checked out, but they're not allowed to go to Britain because of the continental system. So it puts the United States in a very difficult space. And these are policies that are going to harm commercial entities and the folks in New England, for example, various merchants, and, really dangerous for the U.S. economy. So Jefferson, who's president at the time, initiates the Embargo Act, which really is an effort to try to punish Britain and France so that they can't have American trade, but it backfires because it's really hurting American merchants. So we see a very big part of this war attached to commercial activity, and this tells us something important, is that, the United States is starting to become a very significant player, not only in commercial activity on the seas, but in the production of goods that are being, exported. And so that becomes just something to keep in mind, and is connected to what we will look at as like an industrializing America. Not quite yet, with entire, it's still water power at this point, but Hamilton's vision of factories and production, by 1812, is sort of a recipe for at least some degree of economic success. So that's something to keep in mind. A couple of other things that are happening, simultaneously. So we know that there's multiple causes of the War of 1812, just like a lot of things in history, and that these causes kind of compete with each other, but maybe also play off of each other. There is, since the time of the Revolutionary War, there had been, and the before that, the 7 Years' War, the British had been in a relationship with some of the Native American groups and supporting some of the Native American groups. So it's, very much the case that Britain is involved with some of the indigenous peoples, and, with Britain has forts in the West and has conflicted with Native American peoples and so on. But a big part of this is that the British are still in control of what we today recognize as Canada. So this British North America is something that the British really want to protect. They have, people there, even if it's not terribly populated. They are going to provide troops there to support the protection of Canada. And the British would like nothing more than having some type of buffer zone in the area of the Old Northwest. And remember that we see now those lands becoming American states. As that starts to occur, more and more encroachment on British Canada is starting to happen, and the British are concerned about that. They don't want to be butted up next to the Americans. They are thinking that a confederacy of sorts of Native Americans might create some degree of buffer zone and help them protect Canada, especially if those Native American groups are loyal to the British and not to the Americans. And so there's some incentive in a way for the British to support this like kind of indigenous movement that Tecumseh and his brother and others are really going to support. It's not by all means all Native American tribes, but a good number of people start to follow Tecumseh with this idea that, smaller groupings of Native Americans, trying to take on American interests that want to move west, that's not really going to be effective. But if Native American groups could put aside any differences and organize together, they would have, more fruitful numbers to be able to oppose American settlement and basically to protect their land. And so there's a lot at stake for some of the indigenous groups. And Americans are going to be enraged at British policies, and mostly because Americans are going to be very incentivized to go west. And we see this really the case with both of the political parties. There's going to be a very big interest in a westward expansion. And at this point in time, the West is not really like out in California. Think of the West as like Indiana, maybe into Illinois. So groups of white settlers are starting to push and take land away from Native Americans, in areas that are kind of like Tecumseh's, stomping ground. Okay, and that becomes significant. We also have on the American political side, Jefferson as president and William Henry Harrison as somebody who becomes the governor of the Indiana Territory. This is before Indiana is a state. There's quite a few policies that start to drive the way the American government starts to participate with Native American groups, generally tribe by tribe, and oftentimes there are very unfair deals that are made to take away land via treaty. Jefferson has a policy that clearly enforces a great deal more assimilation, so forcing or incentivizing tribes to assimilate to largely be white, to be English speaking, to be settled, to be farmers, to essentially assimilate and kind of integrate to some degree, or to be removed. So this notion of Indian removal, which we'll see in a big way in the 1820s and 30s, and then ultimately reservations that could get created to corral Native American peoples. At this point, Jefferson is initiating a forced migration policy for groups that are not willing to assimilate. And so we not only see treaties that are unfair, we also see forced removal of Native American groups. And that becomes a very significant, opposition. This is what Tecumseh and his brother are very much going to oppose. So I'm going to put a video up just to give you a little bit of a picture. And I'm sorry, there's an ad, so that's going to come up first. And then I'm just going to place the video in the place where we can just look at a map. And where you want to start to look is on the East Coast. This map starts changing, and you can see the years on the lower left, 1789, so around the time of the Constitution. And as you get into 1800, look at that area of blue. The area of blue is white settlement. So where we see white settlers, and keep in mind, what starts to appear is the Louisiana Purchase, which is mostly indigenous land. And then, of course, the blue is going to go outward, in that area too, affecting what becomes, the Pawnee and the Cherokee that get moved from the east, and the Pawnee and so on. So I'm going to stop the video here. You can see this is about the 1850s, several decades after the War of 1812. But the policies that are leading to a loss of land for indigenous people are very much taking place. And, everywhere that you see blue, is areas where there's representation, of lost land. And Tecumseh is somebody as a leader who notices and sees that and tries to create a confederacy of sorts, and will ultimately side with the British in the War of 1812. A couple of other things, just kind of note Tecumseh as really a military leader. He will gain a great deal of respect, especially from some British military leaders, for some of his willingness to fight. He is already and very up for fighting before the War of 1812 even begins. The group that talked about Tecumseh the other day noted some significance about Prophetstown, for example. So there's a great deal of prelude to the War of 1812 in some of the efforts of Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa. I have to say that correctly because I messed that up in the past. And Tenskwatawa is a more of a religious figure who really uses a great deal of spiritual and cultural type of presence to be able to initiate, some degree of protection. We see at various points Native American groups becoming very aligned with some spiritual ideas. And so Tecumseh and his brother end up really with an effort to try to unite tribal groups and use numbers that are going to be fruitful for initiating white settlement. Ultimately, the Battle of Tippecanoe becomes significant because this is Governor William Henry Harrison's moment to try to use the resources of the U.S. federal government to take down the Native American groups that had been pushing back. And it won't be until the Battle of Thames, as part of the War of 1812, that Tecumseh is killed in battle. But the efforts of Tecumseh are very significant, and Native American history is very connected to the War of 1812. And, arguably Native Americans will be a group at the end of the War of 1812, who will find the consequences most significant. They do not really get what they had been hoping for, and what the British even wanted was greater access to land in the former Northwestern Territories. That's something that was initially part of the treaty that ends the War of 1812, but doesn't come to fruition. The settlement policies that we saw on the map. The other thing to note is there's some partisan changes, and this relates a little bit maybe to your Federalist, Democratic, Republican debate. We're starting to see like new generations of politicians, and some of these politicians, who include many Democratic Republicans, become on the side of war hawks. Remember that the Federalist Party tends to favor Britain, doesn't really want to get into a war with Britain. They had been very war hungry when it came to the quasi-war with France, but in this case, we see some of the people evolve to really be the biggest proponents of the War of 1812, becoming not all Democratic Republicans, because quite a few are not in favor of war. Even Madison, the president after Jefferson, arguably is not in favor of war. But we get some younger members of the Democratic Republican Party who see the interests in the West and the economic potential of the West as really the most important priority. And some of these folks may arguably be interested in British Canada, so that maybe a prize that could come to the United States as a result of the War of 1812, and historians debate this, how much was access to Canada really a reason for the War of 1812, but maybe to some people, they're moving into that potential space. Another thing to note is that West Florida, Florida at the time, was actually Spanish territory, but part of Florida was actually annexed in 1810. And this gives some of these like younger Democratic Republicans an interest in trying to acquire all of Florida, which is Spanish territory. Spain is weakening. It makes Florida seem like, easy to take, but there's also indigenous groups like the Seminole Native Americans who dominate population population-wise, the area of Florida. The Warhawks will lead a charge to declare war against Great Britain, and these are essentially Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. These are important names because they become really influential later on in the 1850s in the build-up to the U.S. Civil War. But these Warhawks and their tone and their priorities do create some pressure on President Madison to declare war. So we get some, kind of political focus, and a lot of this is to open up the West. And it is kind of ironic because in a way it feels like very Hamiltonian, but this is economic policies to open up more access for Western territories to become economically developed. Part of this is for agriculture, and as we'll see, it also becomes industrial. So keep in mind this map, we have what's blue, still territories and not states, but we do have some